Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's FIDO Alliance webcast, where we will be looking at the new updates to 863, the digital identity standard, the guidelines from NIST, updates to it, and what does it actually mean with regard to passkeys specifically. We're here to talk about passkeys. Before we get into it, I just have a few housekeeping notes to go through. It's everyone's favorite part of the webcast where I go through the administrative particulars of the webcast. So you will notice that you're in listen only mode, but you do have the opportunity to ask questions. So we do have Ryan Galluzzo here with us from NIST. I will introduce him properly in a moment. But we have saved time at the end of the webcast to answer your questions. So you can ask them as they come to you, but just be aware that we're going to save time at the end. We're going to let Ryan get through his presentation, and then we'll ask him some questions. We're recording the webcast, which means you can come back and watch this later if you miss anything. It will be emailed to you directly after the webcast. And then please stay on at the end, take the survey. If you don't mind, please do that. It really helps us to inform all of our educational programs here at the FIDO Alliance. If I didn't mention it, I'm Megan Shamas. I'm the CMO of the FIDO Alliance, if you don't know me. But I do take in, I read every single one just to ensure that we're giving you the content that you need in order to drive your education and, of course, awareness and deployment of passkeys. I'll go back to this one. That's Ryan's first slide. So again, I'm Megan. Ryan, please help me to welcome Ryan Galluzzo, who has a very long title, which is the Digital Identity Program Lead, Applied Cybersecurity Division at NIST. I think many of you know Ryan, but he is one of the main drivers behind the document that we're going to be discussing today. And also welcome Teresa Wu, who is the Vice President, Smart Credentials at IDEMIA, also serves on the FIDO Alliance Board of Directors and is the co-chair of the Government Deployment Working Group. Teresa has kindly joined us today to help us facilitate some Q&A following Ryan's presentation. So I will not belabor this any further. I will hand it off to Ryan to tell us all about the updates and how passkeys are integrated within them. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Teresa, and thank you, FIDO Alliance, for having me. Very excited to be here. I did originally think that this was just going to be a briefing to the Government Deployment Working Group, so being on here with 237 so far of my closest friends is a little bit less intimate than what I was originally anticipating, but I'm still excited to be here. I'm still excited to give this presentation and talk a little bit about essentially two things that we're going to cover today. It seems like we skipped a couple of the slides there. I'm going to cover two different documents that we have out right now. The one is the supplement that we released to 863.3 versus the Digital Identity Guidelines Draft Revision 4, which is in second public comment draft, and talk a little bit about this concept of a Syncable Authenticator. It's essentially a passkey. Exactly which form of passkey, I think I'm still trying to figure out exactly where the terminology stands, but either a syncable passkey or a multi-device passkey, whichever is in current vogue within the context of the FIDO Alliance. Why we're doing some of this right now. So what are some of the motivators behind both the updates we made to the supplement as well as the digital identity guidelines? What assurance level we're looking at for Syncable Authenticators, and what kind of specific requirements are we going to apply around those from the perspective of both public-facing general use cases and enterprise requirements. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about capitalization. About sharing and attestation, and in particular, how we view some of those risks and threats as they relate to those, and then take your questions. So the big thing I wanted to make sure that we differentiated here is the two different kinds of documents that we have out right now. So the first thing we released, and I believe this was in actually April of this past year, we put out what was called a supplement. And this is actually a fairly new form of document that NIST has started to use as a way to update or advance or improve special publications and other other documents that are already in place. And they give us the opportunity to make targeted adjustments to our special publications based upon a number of different factors, whether it's a change in the threat environment, a change in the technology environment, as we're kind of talking about today. And it allows us to really fill an immediate gap and provide guidance and updated requirements without having to go through the process of completely updating an entire special publication. So it gives us a bit more flexibility than we've had in the past as far as how we update these things. So as far as Syncable Authenticators go and the concept of Passkeys, we found ourselves getting a lot of comments in December when we put out, December of 22, when we put out our first initial public draft of the digital identity guidelines, asking very core questions of when, where, what can I do with Passkeys? There was a lot of linking of the conversations that were happening around Apple and Google and a lot of the platform providers that were heavily promoting these, and then questions on the government side of what can we do with these, when can we do something with these, and NIST, what do you think of these? And so we had initially had the conversation of perhaps we can wait and include these in the update to 863 revision 4 when it goes final. But we also started to do the math on that and realized that that would create a pretty extensive gap in which agencies were not really able to use or have guidance on Passkeys and Syncable Authenticators. So we essentially made the call earlier this year that we can't really wait until Rev 4 gets finalized. We wanted to get some initial guidance out so that agencies that were thinking about using Passkeys and Syncable Authenticators had at least an initial set of requirements and initial guidance to be able to fill that gap with some interim guidance. So as I said, we published in April of this year that supplement, and it went into effect immediately, right? So right now, if you're sitting there thinking about, as a federal agency, thinking about whether or not you can implement a syncable passkey or a syncable authenticator as part of your scheme, you certainly can, and we started to provide an initial set of requirements there. Now that dovetails nicely into the work we're doing with 863, our digital identity guidelines, and the 4th revision. So hopefully everyone here is fairly familiar with the digital identity guidelines. If you're not, they're essentially the core set of requirements for how we do all things digital identity within the federal government, covering proofing, authentication, and federation, as well as the risk management processes. And so we are in the midst of about a 2+ year process of updating from 863 revision 3, which was released in 2017, to revision 4, which we're now in our second public draft of. So we released just 3 weeks ago in August the second public comment draft of our digital identity guidelines. And this included, I'm not going to say verbatim, but pretty close to verbatim, the requirements that we put into the supplement. And this gives us 2 opportunities. One, it allows you all as organizations that are implementing to see how this fits into the guidance in its more kind of permanent long-term form. And it allows us to collect feedback from you all more effectively on what the requirements should look like. So we've got generally positive feedback on the requirements we put in 63B in the supplement, but we haven't got formal feedback through a public comment period process. And so that's what we're hoping to do here. All the requirements that I'm going to discuss today, all the concepts that I'm going to discuss today are in the second public comment draft. And we do very, very much encourage you all to send comments on this particular topic, particularly as you start to think about and evaluate these things yourself. And I'll talk about this probably more times than you want to hear it, but October 7th is the end of the public comment period. So again, please provide comments. We'll have some links in this deck as we go through here, but it gives us an opportunity to get those things. So just to summarize, the supplement is in force. It is a thing that exists now. The digital identity guidelines in draft revision 4, second public comment period, is what we're working on right now and taking comments on. The requirements are generally the same. They're just 2 different vehicles for us to be able to execute on our overall goal of promoting phishing resistance more broadly. Okay, so what is a syncable authenticator? I don't think I really need to explain this to this group here, but I'm going to just go ahead and explain really quickly why we didn't just use the term passkey or syncable passkey or whatever we're currently slated on within the FIDO conversation here. Part of the reason that we choose to use these kind of generic terms is essentially to avoid alignment to any one specific implementation, even when that sometimes is something we want to do. In this particular instance, we really wanted to make sure that we talked about the characteristics and the concepts without necessarily being tied to something like the term passkey, particularly given there may be ways in the future to implement this that might not necessarily be FIDO. But at the moment, the scaled version of this is a FIDO passkey. And we're talking about Syncable Authenticators. We're talking about any software or hardware cryptographic authenticators that allow you to take a key, clone it, export it, and store it somewhere other than where it was originally created. And this is something that at its core was not really allowed in 863 revision 3, which is one of the reasons that we had to focus very heavily on trying to get a quick supplement out to address this particular concept. We also talk about some requirements for the sync fabric. Again, I don't think this is a unfamiliar term to anyone who works in the FIDO space, but really this is wherever those things are stored. That's not that main and primary device, and it is also the ability to transmit and store those things across things. To sum it up, it's essentially a syncable passkey or multi-device passkey. Again, I'm not sure exactly where we stand on the current FIDO terminology that is most popular, but this is the kind of implementation we're really looking at in practice at the moment. So why now? One of the big things that we wanted to be able to do was open the door for federal agencies to provide much more effective and scaled phishing-resistant authentication. And we've had phishing-resistant authentication available to agencies and organizations for quite a while in the form of traditional FIDO authenticators and hardware authenticators, but we just hadn't seen the same degree of scale and adoption because of the kind of form factor and certain things that play into it. And so the possibility and the optionality that we had with something like a passkey that really didn't require you to go out and get a new thing, dongle, whatever it might be, and have that available to you to do your authentication. Instead relied in most cases either on an app or a device that you had readily available, was very appealing. Plus the fact that we were seeing an incredible rise in phishing attacks on different forms of authentication. We really wanted to make sure that we gave agencies at least the opportunity to evaluate and understand how Syncable Authenticators work and how they might be able to make use of this technology in support of their applications. One of the main problems, which I already touched on, was if you read 863.3, it's pretty explicit about not allowing the cloning of authentication keys in basically any use case. And so our first and highest primary motivator for releasing the supplement and getting that change out was to be able to say, hey, look, context has changed since 2017. And within the discussion of, in particular, AAL2 level of authenticators, those of you not familiar with our AAL levels, that's our kind of moderate level of authenticators. This seems reasonable, particularly compared to a lot of the other threat models and threat surfaces that we're looking at. And so we wanted to make sure we could make that change, make that update, and basically say, look, these are a potential option for federal agencies to use, and here's some additional considerations. The other thing we wanted to make sure of is we started to think about how this fit within the changing consumer landscape of users that are expecting federal government agencies to be able to make use of the same kinds of commercial technologies that our partners in the private sector are looking at. So looking at the fact that just like most commercial entities, our government users are not on one single device. And number two, a lot of them have serious problems with federal accounts and doing account recovery, which in particular, Syncable Authenticators and Passkeys are very helpful in supporting. So we're trying to take this kind of holistic picture, and once we started to see some of the scale in particular of adoption, as well as the comparing the risks and threats as they fit within the context of things like SMS OTP and other phishing, other authenticators that were essentially vulnerable to phishing threats, we saw this as a huge opportunity to at least open the door and provide the opportunity and the considerations for federal agencies to start bringing on scaled phishing resistance. The other thing I'll note is that the standards definitely started to mature, particularly even between now and, or even between December 22 when we released revision 4 of 863 and when we ultimately ended up putting this out. There's still work being done. We're still working with a lot of the folks working on the Trust Signal Working Group to help even further harden a lot of the stuff that's going on here. But we still saw this as the right time and the right opportunity to get ahead of this and at least allow for agencies to think about these within the context of their deployments and how it might work for them from a risk mitigation perspective. So Syncable Authenticators at AAL2. And again, for those of you not familiar with 863.3 and 863.4, the digital identity guidelines, we essentially lay out 3 assurance levels of almost everything. Within the context of authentication, we have our authentication assurance levels. AAL1 is essentially single factor authentication passwords. AAL2 is a much broader bucket of multi-factor authentication that includes everything from SMS OTP to OTP apps to push authentication, and now to a similar set of authenticator capabilities, at least in our view, from the perspective of Syncable Authenticators. And then we have AAL3, which is non-exportable, not quite hardware constrained, but for the most part, in a lot of implementations focused on hardware. And it's really for your highest risk, highest assurance use cases. So within this middle ground, we started to look at the threats that are mitigated by Syncable Authenticators, and we started to look at how those compared again to other sets of authenticators at AAL2, and really started to see some of the value there, particularly from a phishing resistant perspective and replay resistance perspective, which is something you simply don't get with a lot of the other allowable authenticators that already exist at AAL2. We also viewed it when deployed with the user verification flag as being essentially a multi-factor cryptographic authenticator, which gave you a lot of value in a single device for that end user, and probably less important, but still important nonetheless, when deployed with that user presence flag, also gives you an authenticator intent from the end user, letting you know that they actually intended to do an authentication. At the end of the day, with the considerations in place in 863 and in the supplement and now in the revision 4, we really do view this as being fairly well aligned to the risk and threat model that we see at AAL2. There are some folks out there that are going to push back and indicate, hey, look, we really, this is not something that we see as being comparable to things like hardware keys or hardware security keys, and that's a great response. We don't intend for these to be replacing those kinds of authenticators, particularly when they are necessary at the AAL3 authentication level. But again, looking at the comparables out there for other authentication options, we felt it fit nicely in the risk and threat model from what we see at AAL2. So we also started to put together some initial requirements. And I want to be clear on these requirements in a couple of the motivators behind them. One was, yes, we wanted to make sure that we got word out to federal agencies. These are the things you should be thinking about. Clarify in particular that requirement around cloning or the kind of modification of that cloning requirement, but also start to make sure that we at least express to the broader community of passkey providers, platform providers. These are what we were hoping to see as far as requirements go, what we thought were kind of the right level setters as far as what the expectations are. And so in particular with these, we know that in some cases, you're not going to have all the visibility necessary to confirm in a hard way every single one of these requirements. But again, we're still trying to make sure that these are expressed and clear to the broader community what our expectations are for how this should be done correctly. So the kind of initial one here is Syncable Authenticators making use of local authentication event to a locally stored password, locally stored key, and shall be used with another authenticator. Essentially, what we're looking at here is we don't, there was some confusion with some of the folks we initially talked about or where the key was stored. We want to make sure that this is based on a local unlock event and making use of a local unlock and locally stored secrets. And then it should also, when not, or when that doesn't happen, it should be used with another authenticator, potentially something like user selected password. So essentially, this is the requirement that allows us to make that a multi-factor cryptographic authenticator. We want to make sure that all keys are generated using approved cryptography. And that's a pretty nebulous statement, but essentially we use this pretty consistently within 863.3 to refer to what amounts to approved cryptographic algorithms under the context of the US federal government and NIST. So things like in the FIPS 140, but not necessarily mandating something like FIPS 140 validation for your modules. We want to make sure that private keys that are cloned or exported from a device are stored in an encrypted format. And we've got some initial feedback that folks would like to better understand exactly what we mean by encrypted format. But the bottom line is we don't want those keys in plain text, and we certainly don't want them vulnerable to a compromise at the password or the passkey provider. We want all authentication transactions to be perform private key operations on the local device using cryptographic keys that are generated on device or recovered from the same fabric. So again, looking at the authentication events to be performed locally and not be performed using something like cloud and transmitting those back down. So the bottom line is we want everything to be done from a local authentication perspective when it comes to the actual authentication event. Private keys stored in the cloud shall be protected by access control mechanisms such that only the authenticated user can access their private keys. This is really focusing on the idea that we want to make sure, again, that we are resistant to the passkey provider becoming compromised. We don't want anything happening within that syncing fabric that would allow for an attacker to simply go in and export keys on a user's behalf. So making sure that there's strong authentication or strong access controls in place to protect those keys when stored. And then going further with the next requirement here to make sure that if you are storing those keys in a sync fabric, the user has to be authenticated at least at AAL2 before accessing those stored keys and syncing them down to something else. Now, this is probably one of the harder requirements to prove is in place, but we still think it's a core foundational thing. In many cases is actually being implemented by a lot of the providers, but not necessarily all of them. The other thing that we want to make sure that we are doing with a lot of this stuff is that the requirements and any agency-specific requirements are documented and communicated, including on public-facing websites and digital service policies where applicable. And again, this is more about communicating to the end user what's happening so that that end user understands while they're doing their enrollment and when they're leveraging and when an agency is leveraging something like a passkey or a syncable authenticator. It's clear and it's clear to the user what's happening and how it's happening and what is an acceptable option as far as the authentications go. I'm going to talk a little bit about this last one here, and then we have a whole another slide where I want to talk about this in more detail. But essentially, attestations should not be used for broad-facing public applications. And the most important aspect of this requirement is this concept of broad public-facing applications. We like attestation, so I want to be clear on that. The idea of being able to provide additional information that is helpful and valuable when making a security decision is very useful to the relying party in determining how much and to what degree they are going to trust an authenticator, whether it's a passkey or anything else. Our challenge and our concern here is that a relying party is going to block passkeys or not allow an individual to use a passkey because their provider does not provide attestation. And frankly, right now, there are not a lot of providers that offer attestation, particularly in public-facing use cases. So we originally had framed this as a should not be used for public-facing applications, but we've slightly changed some of that context within our second public draft that just came out to be clear that it should not block the ability of an end user to leverage a syncable authenticator, and instead it should be one decisioning factor that can be used in whether or not and to what degree an RP may choose to trust it. And so this is, I think, an important distinction that we've made between the two, in that, you know, we would, again, like attestation to begin moving forward. However, in the fact that we know it's not currently available in a lot of use cases, we leave it on the agency to be able to make a decision about whether or not they feel like they need attestation. And if it's not there, to not block that user from being able to use it, but instead potentially add something like a mitigating control or compensating control or another authentication factor onto that to allow them to enable that user to make use of their phishing-resistant authenticator and not block them from being able to make use of that within a particular workflow or use case. On the enterprise side, and I guess probably should have clarified this real quick before diving in, this is one of the few places where we've really looked at this idea of separating out the enterprise from general public-facing applications. We did that because in this particular instance, there's actually a lot of additional controls that can be applied with respect to phishing or with respect to syncable authenticators within an enterprise context, where you have greater control over devices in a lot of instances to be able to restrict things like sharing or restrict things like keys moving to unapproved devices or unapproved syncing fabrics. And so there's a slightly different context there, and we wanted to make sure that we actually distinguish between those two things within the context of a requirement set. This is something that we did carry over to Revision 4 as well, too. So for the enterprise side, and again, being clear, this is contractors, employees, and some mission partners of federal agencies where there's a greater degree of control. This is not your public-facing applications where individuals might be using these. Looking at, in particular, making sure that you have FISMA alignment. And so we, in particular, look for FISMA moderate protections or comparable. And this is very similar to most of our other cryptographic authentication capabilities and authenticator types. It's not new. It's not something different. It's not something unique. We did think it was necessary to make sure that was absolutely clear with any kind of a syncable authenticator used within the federal context. We wanted to make sure that devices that generate, store, and sync authenticators containing federal enterprise private keys are protected by MDM software, so mobile device management software, or other device configuration controls to prevent the syncing of keys to unauthorized devices or sync fabrics. Essentially, we think it's very, very important to be able to set the policy and enforce the policy on what is done with keys and with syncable authenticators within the context of the enterprise. One way to do that is mobile device management software. There are other potential configurations, things like managed devices or managed accounts that could also be applied here to help manage some of that policy. We also want to make sure that access to any kind of syncing fabric is done through either an agency managed or other kind of managed account that allows them to determine who has access to that backend application or backend sets of capabilities where keys might be synced. So this would be your agency identity management system, potentially using something like single sign-on, potentially using something like PIV access to be able to protect the actual syncing fabric and any keys or information related to those keys stored internally. And then authenticators that generate private keys should support attestation. Again, given the fact that this is an enterprise use case, things like enterprise attestation can be supported here. Your mobile device management software can help with some of those attestations. There's a lot more viability and options from an attestation perspective that can help in making some of these decisions and help the relying parties on the enterprise side here make some of those decisions. And I guess the last clarification as well, too, as we start to think about these specific requirements, there are a whole bunch of other AAL2 requirements that we have not gone into here. This isn't to say that those don't apply. These are essentially additive to that, including where it makes sense, things like FIPS 140 validation. Okay. So another thing that we did that was slightly different than what we typically do with our other authenticator types is we started to look in a little at some of the actual implementations and implementation capabilities that exist within the WebAuthn specification. And in particular, looking at some of the flags that we thought were really essential for relying parties to actually make informed decisions about how to treat the specific authenticators that were going to start to show up at their front door. We looked initially at the user presence flag. We think this is helpful, not super valuable, particularly if you're getting the UV, but at the end of the day, we want relying parties on the federal side to be looking at that to determine whether or not the user is present and whether or not they have demonstrated some degree of control over the authenticator and some degree of intent to participate in the authentication event. It's a basic requirement that we have at AAL2. This kind of helps carry through on that. More importantly is the user verified flag. And we very, very, very much want to see agencies inspecting this and understanding this during the registration to make sure they know whether or not they can treat an authenticator as being a cryptographic multi-factor authenticator. So I think probably most people on here are familiar with the UV flag, but just in case you're not, it's essentially an indicator of whether or not a user verification occurred, typically locally, or with the passkey provider before the WebAuthn statement was generated and passed off, and make sure that the passkey had some kind of local authentication or local verification event occur. That is essential to being able to actually call that passkey or that syncable authenticator a cryptographic multi-factor authenticator. Absent that, we ask that agencies treat those as a single factor authenticator because they don't know whether that multi-factor event took place. Backup eligibility, again, this is a flag that basically indicates whether or not that user has stored their passkey somewhere else or that syncable authenticator somewhere else. And again, the thing that's helpful here is if an agency does make a decision that they want to restrict implementations where they don't wish for an authenticator to be backed up or saved somewhere else, this can be used as a way to restrict by policy that actual backup. And then backup state, again, this is not necessarily as valuable, but again, it's more around making certain decisions about whether or not the authenticator has actually already been backed up as opposed to whether it can be backed up. And this is more around setting the policy on the relying party side about whether they're going to allow for that backup. And then if it occurs, whether they're going to change any certain decisions on whether or not that's going to go in, and whether or not it can be accepted for a specific authentication event. The big difference here is that for public-facing applications, we really don't want agencies to be making a decision that once someone backs up an authenticator, they can no longer use it again. So if you're going to allow for backup eligibility, the backup state then should probably not be as important because of the fact that you have allowed for that. And at the end of the day, the end user is going to probably have a lot of confusion as to why an authenticator might have been viable at one point in time and now is no longer viable because it has been backed up. So it's really about expressing clearly to the end user, making sure the end user has clear expectations when using an authenticator in that workflow. Last thing I think to cover with all of these things, and probably more of a general statement than anything else, not all syncable authenticators and not all WebAuthn credential deployments are going to work for all federal agencies and federal use cases. Again, the key here is to provide some initial requirements and considerations that can allow for federal agencies to assess the viability, the risks associated with these kinds of authenticators, and make a decision for themselves whether or not they should be introducing it into their workflow and provide it for their users as an authentication option. We would like to see it because of its phishing resistance capabilities. But again, if you're looking at things that are higher risk, like AAL3 applications, this is not where you should be applying these kinds of authenticators. All right, so the other thing we started to think about when we had these conversations about these kinds of authenticators and the changing kind of security paradigm that they introduced because of the fact that these authenticators are moving off the initial device and potentially being shared into different locations, is the fact that it creates a lot of concern about maintaining possession and binding to the original end user who established and registered that passkey. And this is a security concern that we completely understand. But I think as we started to peel back the layers and think about how it compared again to other AAL2 authenticators, there's not a lot of difference in the security footprint and the actual capabilities to share an authenticator. In most instances, with most implementations of AAL2 authenticators, there is a very easy way for that end user to go ahead and share that authenticator with others, and that it would not necessarily be understood or indicated in any way, shape, or form for the relying party. So while we do understand and view security sharing in particular as a security concern, it's not all that different than the security concerns that would exist with any other AAL2 authenticators. Again, I think making sure that we stress with all of this that this is comparable to other AAL2 authenticators and not to AAL3 authenticators and other kind of authenticators that have even higher security expectations and features. We're trying to compare like authenticators to like authenticators and think about the threats and risks associated with those in a comparable kind of low to moderate level of authentication event where MFA is required. Same thing with attestation. So one of the main conversations that we've had since releasing the supplement is people said, great, these requirements look fun, they look neat, we generally agree and approve of them. However, I have no idea whether or not the passkey provider that my users are choosing to implement are actually doing any of the things that you stated in your requirements. And that is certainly true. We also feel that that is certainly true for most multi-factor authentication scenarios where the end user, particularly public-facing end users, are bringing their own authenticator to the equation. This is certainly true with things like time-based OTP apps from authenticators where you don't necessarily know explicitly how that's being protected by the app. You don't necessarily know the key length that's being used to generate that OTP. There's a lot of unknowns there, right? So hard, strict compliance to what we've written for our OTP authenticator requirements when I bring your own authenticators in place. Can't guarantee that either. Same with whatever form of SMS OTPs being brought to the table. Then also looking at things like PIN length on certain kinds of authenticators for cryptographic multi-factor authenticators. At the end of the day, there is a certain degree of risk that must be accepted no matter what if the end user is bringing their own authenticator to the table. And we don't think that's all that different to the scenario that we're seeing with syncable authenticators. In particular, in going through a lot of the requirements and talking through with many of the providers, there's a lot of passkey providers and platforms that are doing the right thing, a high percentage of them, but that does not mean all of them. So all those things taken into account, like we understand that attestation provides a lot of value from the perspective of better understanding and knowing as a relying party the detailed capabilities that a passkey provider might have. The big problem is for public-facing use cases right now, they're simply not sufficiently available, right? So that leaves us in a scenario where we've got a whole bunch of requirements. Everyone says they're great. Well, that maybe they don't all say them great, but generally agree with the kind of crux of a lot of those requirements, but there's not a lot of visibility into how well those are being applied without doing kind of a blanket assessment of what folks are doing. Now, I think in most kind of low to moderate risk use cases that kind of bucket into AAL2, that probably doesn't matter that much because, you know, you've got a general set of good controls in place already, and that's a good multi-factor authentication experience. And a lot of the threats are fairly similar to the threats that you face with any other bring your own authentication scenario. That being said, we do know that there's a lot of organizations and entities out there that are going to remain uncomfortable with limited attestation and limited visibility into what controls are in place. What we'd say there is we really don't want that to be a blocker to the use of efficient, scaled phishing-resistant authentication. And while we don't love the user experience of adding something like another factor or another compensating control to account for the lack of confidence in the passkey implementations, that is far preferable to blocking phishing-resistant authentication and pushing individuals back to much more vulnerable forms of authentication, such as SMS OTP, coupled with a password. So we hear and understand the concerns about attestation. We are hoping that there are certain use cases for which, you know, you can accept AL2 authentication with a passkey without that attestation based upon the general practices of the broader community. We also understand there's a lot of folks that that's simply not palatable or viable, in which case, you know, absent that attestation, we ask that you don't block these things. We ask that you instead evaluate the risk and add compensating controls to the degree possible to allow for that phishing resistance to maintain as a capability. All right, so the key takeaways, and then I will be quiet and let you all ask questions that I can hopefully answer. Number one, we want agencies, we want organizations to be evaluating Syncable Authenticators alongside all of the other AAL2 authenticators you offer. At the end of the day, we think it's a pretty consistent set of capabilities, and in most cases, even preferable, unattested to a lot of the stuff that are being done right now at AAL2. We want people to offer Syncable Authenticators, particularly for public-facing applications at AAL2. There's a lot of public-facing AAL2 applications that are a very broad range of capabilities and cover a broad spectrum of risks. We'd like people to think about those things and think about where you can fit this in for those public-facing applications to start to scale phishing resistance beyond where it is today in a way that's going to ultimately help provide greater protection for most folks. I want to assess the risks of sharing and limited attestation to your security model. I would say don't make a blanket decision one way or the other, whether to force a compensating control or not. Look at your existing risk management tools, look at your threat models, look at your threat landscape, look at the risks that you have focused on your specific applications, and make a well-intentioned decision about what you want to do as far as whether you're going to add or not add some kind of a compensating control in the absence of attestation. And if necessary, go ahead and apply those additional controls, but please don't be blocking phishing-resistant authentication out of a kind of general determination that attestation isn't sufficient in its current state. So those are kind of the key things that we want to make sure that folks take away from this. I will note, in particular, on the attestation front, you know, we are participating in the Trust Signal group within the FIDO Alliance that is doing a lot of really good work to help try and identify a path forward to greater visibility into the practices of both the providers of passkeys as well as the platforms that support some of that. And so we're hopeful that a lot of the kind of concerns that some folks have expressed today around limited visibility into the security practices and things like sharing of passkeys are addressed hopefully by some of the work being done there and some of the capabilities being advanced there. So you know, we think it's a world that's in an ever advancing place, but you know, we do think there's a lot of value and security and usability capabilities that are emerging within the context of these kinds of authenticators that it's important agencies and organizations are effectively evaluating and hopefully implementing where it makes sense. This is just stuff about calling us and sending us messages and sending us notes. Big thing I want to note here one more time is public comment period is open and closes on October 7th. We'll make sure these slides get around to everyone, but at the end of the day, there's a link in here for public comments on 63 Revision 4. So please send them our way, and we are more than happy to take them and address them appropriately. And I think that's it, Teresa. I'll hand over to you for passing this off to the questions and answer side of the house.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you. I feel like after like third time you presenting this, you're speaking faster and faster. You can beat that under like speed record, time record. So I have some logistical questions for you before we start taking questions from the audience. So have you gathered all the public comment after October 7th? What is the plan for NIST? Is it directly publishing version 4, or is we gonna expect to see another like PD3, public draft 3?
We do not plan on a public draft 3. So the intent is to go to final at the end of this public comment period. Now I can't speak in absolutes because we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. But the intent is to certainly proceed to final.
Okay, so
get your
people
comments
out there, comment is October 7th because we may not get another chance. That's what I'm hearing. So now for version 4, is there a targeted timeline that NIST would like to get this published?
Next year. And that's probably as close as I can get at this point. We haven't got comments yet, so we don't know how many we're going to get. Like I said, we got 3,876 comments on the the initial public draft. If we get 3,000 comments again, I don't know when next year, but probably later next year. If we get fewer than that, it will probably be sooner. I would say, we're hopeful to try and get it out in the first half of next year, but it'll entirely depend on how many comments we get.
Okay, and then I have a third one. I read, like you said earlier, like using the supplement to publish the Syncable Authenticator as a supplement. If there's a lot of comment, do you continue to use the supplement as a tool to update the guideline in between the draft 4 coming up, or that's sort of a one-time thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will depend on what the scenario is. It's certainly a tool that's in our kit bag. It's certainly a tool that we will use if we have to. I don't think our preference would be to, put out like a supplement every year or two. I think it would be much more focused on if there was a substantial change from the perspective of like the technology of the threat landscape. Like if we were to find out about a new and emerging technology that modifies or contradicts some of the requirements we have, it would be something we would consider. I would also say if it was something to the effect of, like a game-breaking threat that emerges that we feel like we need to put some kind of guidance out about. So it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility, but it's certainly not going to be like our preferred approach to like iteratively updating and changing specific requirements. It would be very targeted and very focused on a real, practical, probably substantial challenge.
Thank you. Megan, I think we can go to the audience questions.
Yeah.
I have.
So let me just ask this one real quick, Teresa, because I think there's a lot of questions about the attestation piece of this, but could you, Ryan, just give the audience like a perspective on how y'all are defining attestation as it relates to then how you talk about attestation in here? And that's, just broadly, what do you mean by attestation so that we can level set and kind of get into a few other questions?
Yeah, and with certain authenticators, it'll take certain forms, but in the context of this, we're essentially talking about a statement from whoever generated the passkey that basically says these are the security features, these are the kind of device that it came from. It will contain a certain set of information about the origin of the passkey, as well as the, to a certain degree, certain security features associated with it. Whether it was created in software and hardware. So All the things that ultimately end up getting wrapped in there is going to depend on the authenticator and depend on like where the community lands on what the actual standard is going to end up being for that attestation. But it's essentially a signed statement from whoever generates that authenticator about the characteristics and origin of that authenticator.
Right. So about those characteristics, not defining those necessarily, because there are historical ways we looked at attestation when it pertains to what we refer to now as device-bound passkeys, which are housed on FIDO security keys. But that doesn't, those set of characteristics not necessarily has to be the ABC of what we mean by attestations. When we use terms like trust signals, we mean like, we're not going to say exactly what that is, but there's a signal that's given that allows you to trust the origin or provenance of the authenticator, if that's fair. And these things are, when it comes to sync passkeys, in the process of being defined.
Correct. I mean, that's what one of the things that FIDO, it's good at is member driven, and we started a study group to do that together, and hopefully, like Ryan lead to, as we mature, it will probably provide better definition, and maybe there's another supplement about trust signal at some point in the future. Who knows? But I think that's collectively we're working on that inside the FIDO Alliance with the member company.
Yeah, and like I said, we're participating in that trust signals working group, and I think it's a question of, there's a lot of questions about what information is needed, how much information is needed, what's a practical amount of information to be asked for, who's going to be authorities for signing and distributing a lot of that stuff. There's still a lot of practical questions that I think need to be resolved that group is working towards. By the way, it looks like we're on about 50 questions. So I'm not sure how many we're going to get through in the next 13 minutes, but
the lucky thing is that I anticipated this because I knew what Ryan was going to present, and I knew there would be questions. I knew he would actually answer a lot of them in his presentation, which means put together really good presentations. Thank you. So 50 of them, only now 30 of them are needed to be answered in the next 13 minutes. I'm just kidding. But I think we can group some of these together.
Do an easy one, like Megan. Let's do an easy one.
Let's do that one. Go ahead. Yes, let's do the
okay. How device-bound passkey? Because talk about passkey, and the whole time we talk about sync passkey. In this new guideline, I think just a reminder: where does the device-bound passkey falls in the guidelines, right? As a security keys.
Yeah,
it's pretty obvious for the identity nerds, but let's just put it out of the way.
Yeah, so I mean, and again, we focused here on Syncable Authenticators because that was what was new and different about what we put in the supplement, and that's what it focused on. That's also what some of the major changes were to 63B in the revision that we just put out. We still pretty much treat device-bound passkeys as AAL3 authenticators for the most part, because of the fact that they are, the key is not exportable. So one of the key distinctions that we have within the context of Rev 4 is that a AAL3 authenticator needs to both be phishing resistant and needs to support the concept of non-exportability. So the primary difference there at AAL2 and AAL3 from the perspective of cryptographic authenticators is that inability to export it from the device that generated it. So your device-bound passkeys, yes, cool, awesome. We still love those. They are AAL3. And they operate in a slightly different context and a slightly different security level than what we'd expect a syncable passkey to function at.
And there weren't any changes with regard to security keys or device-bound passkeys in the new draft, right? It didn't look that way to me, but
there is a slight distinction. I don't know so much that it was a difference in this versus the initial public draft. We have backed away from mandating explicitly hardware, particularly from the perspective of looking at things like platform authenticators. So we focus more on the characteristic of non-exportability as opposed to explicitly mandating that it's kind of that hardware-based concept. But in practice, it's still probably what we'll see a lot, but we are looking at opening the door to platform-based authenticators where they can support that non-exportability feature.
All right. So one more questions.
We have 10 minutes and 54 questions. I would say 2 or 3 more. Yeah.
So Megan is prioritizing. I let Megan is the CMO.
So the design attestation, there's some questions around how you can demonstrate that you meet AL2 without attestation for public-facing applications, meaning meeting the other requirements, but the demonstration of it still seems a little murky to some folks.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think the characteristics of any bring your own authenticator are going to require a degree of trust and understanding what the state of practice is related to that authenticator. You're not going to necessarily know that all of those things are met, except by understanding what the general practices are across the board. Looking at the flags will give you an indicator of a certain degree of authentication capability, particularly the UV flag and that multi-factor functionality that brings. But ultimately, it's going to depend on whether or not the relying party is going to trust those statements without an attestation associated with them. And in practice right now, there's not many folks that are providing that attestation for public-facing use cases.
I continue to, yes, thank you. Someone just said we should do an FAQ based on the questions and answers from this because there are a lot. Thank you. Good idea.
How about 53, Megan?
53. If it's you. No, I'm just kidding. Oh, come on. Okay. No, we'll go back to that. Hold on. No, I had one. 28. Then we're going back to the beginning. So we're not going to leave you behind, those people that ask questions at the beginning. There are some, I think this goes back to what you just kind of said, Ryan, but there are some implementations, like, for example, I mean, we would refer to them as third-party passkey provider, so they're not the OS-based ones, but there are, some implementations where UV is not, it's a cache, or like you can, do it once and it's like, remember me, kind of a thing. So that's the really like technical way of describing it. But in terms of, in those kind of terms, like how do you look at UV when the implementations from the passkey providers might, for user experience reasons, you allow the same UV to be kind of like cached over a period of time?
For an extended period of time, yeah. Again, look, I think probably the number, and again, I think it's going to depend on who your user population is and what your level of risk tolerance is, how far you're going to go with some of these things. We've certainly now observed that there are folks that are using UV cache or UVs that are extended for a very, very, very long period of time. I think at the end of the day, the consideration is what degree that maps up to your risk tolerance and the degree to which you're willing to accept some kind of a UV event that occurred a day ago, 2 days ago, a week ago. Now, in strict compliance practices, you don't want that. And it probably wouldn't be fully compliant with what we've got laid out at AAL2. But again, I don't know how many of your users are going to be using something like 1Password versus coming with a platform-based authenticator like Apple or Google, which probably have a much tighter UV flag. But again, it's going to probably come down to understanding that ultimate risk decisioning. And again, we don't have a concern if people would like to go and add a second authentication factor or some kind of a risk mitigating control if you're simply not comfortable with that. But again, I think in the comparables, it would require them to have compromised your 1Password and your in a way that is a little less scalable than we probably see again with most other second factors, particularly when phishing is a pretty easy tool for scaling attacks.
Thank you. And this was not planted by anyone, but I swear. Did you consider that perhaps synced passkeys should have their own level because they really shouldn't set aside phishable authentication methods in AL2?
So we've heard a lot of that, but the idea of potentially creating a single authentication assurance level just for one type of authenticator didn't seem terribly appealing, particularly given we have had phishing-resistant authenticator as an option that need to be offered at AL2 to begin with. I think our preference would be to see that designated in like authentication context and authentication method type language, because at the end of the day, AL2 covers a pretty broad spectrum of authenticator types. And we're expecting relying parties might have decisions about individual authenticators that they like to see or would not like to see, and would be able to then specify that within those kinds of contexts and within things like profiles rather than within a separate assurance level. But we've certainly had comments about there should be 4 assurance levels, there should be a 2.5. At the end of the day, I think in practice, when agencies go in and make decisions about what to implement for their public-facing use cases, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference, since they're going to offer as many options as possible.
Right, and I think if you dig into it, it's pretty clearly stated that, you know, phishing resistant, you know, this is a phishing resistant authentication mechanism. I think it's more for the sake of folks that have to explain it to others, that then you have to dig in and say, well, this one's this one, this one's that one. But I think that's fair. That's a fair enough answer to why that wouldn't make sense. Okay, I think we have time for maybe just one more question. So let's ask the hardest one of all. No, there aren't any hard ones.
There's a lot there.
A lot of you had the same really questions around demonstrating, you know, AL2 and the piece about and without, you know, necessarily having attestation. Questions around the UV flag, which I think, you know, we talked about. I think that we can maybe leave it there. And again, yeah, go ahead.
Since we, I'd like to just remind them, the audience, right? Yes, the 63B is about the authenticator, but there are I mean, Ryan, I feel like the section A and section C has the most rewrite out of between the 2 drafts. I'm interested in identity proofing, and you know, FIDO Alliance has a certification program for identity verifications now. What would be, if you have like one thing for people to go look in the standard, what would that be in section A and C?
So A, I would say probably take a look at the updated metrics and requirements as they relate to document authentication, as well as the requirements that we've added around fraud mitigation tools. They're pretty light at this point, just based upon overall capability and maturity. But and then in 63C, we've added an entire subsection on the idea of wallet-based authenticators, or sorry, wallet-based federation. So essentially using something like a subscriber or user control wallet as an identity provider that provides essentially signed attestations of identity. So I would say take a look at that, and take a look in particular at the requirements that we have built in there.
Thank you. Otherwise, we're going to have to invite you back and do a section A, and maybe we'll have a couple hundred more people.
I'm trying to.
If we all do like a office hour.
Put the date on the calendar right now, so just. I want to thank you all. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Teresa. I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to remind you that we are in public review for the document. You can send your comments directly to NIST. You could also just say hey to Ryan. You can just email him at any point in time just to say hey. Also, if you're a member of the FIDO Alliance, we also will be providing comments directly to NIST through GDWG. Teresa's leading that, and there's an active engagement going on with compiling those comments. So if you're part of FIDO Alliance, we'd love you to take part in that if you have comments. And if you asked a question and we did not get to answer it, we will be going through every question and ensuring that we reach out to you if there's anything that we missed. But again, thank you for your time. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Teresa. And please do the survey. Join us at Authenticate 2024 next month. If you have, we will have our friends from NIST there, as well as a whole agenda full of awesome content relating to Passkeys. So please join us there. And also please join us on a future FIDO webcast. Thank you and have a great day.